This is Boston's Black History, Inspiring Our Future, a Boston 25 News special presentation.
Without diversity, we cannot be excellent.
They're dreamers.
I didn't even know Boston was ready for an African-American chief.
Doers.
They believed in me to lead this city.
And trailblazers.
Being a woman changes the game in a lot of ways.
Who broke barriers.
We took a stand.
And changed Boston's Black history.
Never, ever, ever forget where you came from.
Thanks for joining us for this Boston 25 News special presentation celebrating Boston's rich Black history. During the next half hour, we'll sit down with African Americans who are on the front lines of education, technology, and public service, and they're the first in their fields. We'll begin with Boston Police Superintendent Chief William Gross, sworn in back in 2014 after 30 years on the job. He became the city's first Black police chief.
This is it, and this showcases history.
I stepped into Boston Police headquarters and right into Chief William Gross's office, better known as his museum.
And my #1 mentor, Willis D. Saunders. Tuskegee Airman, became a Boston police officer, rose to the rank of deputy.
Chief Gross's journey from country kid to one of Boston's top cops started on his grandmother's farm in Hillsborough, Maryland.
Pretty much he programmed me because all we would watch is westerns and cop movies and cop TV shows.
But soon the urban scenes in those cop TV shows became his reality. At 12, he moved to Dorchester to live with his mother and 2 sisters.
And I arrived in Boston in 1975 at the height of forced busing. So it wasn't popular to have that attitude of wanting to be on the police department then.
More than 30 years after he joined the force in 1983, he was sworn in as the first African-American superintendent-in-chief for the Boston Police Department.
I didn't even know if Boston was ready for an African-American chief. But I knew that Boston was moving in the directions that would distance it from its horrid past of racism and exclusion.
Have you ever been the subject of racism on the job?
Absolutely. When I first came on in '83 as a cadet, sometimes you would hear the N-word, and sometimes you would hear Caucasians spoke about in a certain way as well.
The chief dealt with it thinking of his grandmother's advice when he was called the N-word back in grade school in Maryland.
And then she said, baby, you need to tell someone first, because just because of the color of your skin, a lot of people are going to think when you hear something negative, you're going to automatically respond with violence. And you're bigger and better than that, and I taught you better than that. So take a step back. People can change. Views can change, but sometimes those being oppressed have to teach the oppressors.
So when we take that victory away together, we can work on everything else.
It's a lesson the chief says he teaches the young people in the community he works with, the cadets and the officers he mentors, like Officer Dennis Simmons, who died from injuries sustained in the hunt for the suspects in the Boston Marathon bombing. His photo has a prominent place in the museum.
It was one of the toughest days of my career when I'm in the hospital in the emergency room watching him on that table, just hoping for one last breath.
The command staff, the officers that are coming after you, what do you hope that they carry into the future?
Never forget where you came from. And you should have that empathy, sympathy, care, and respect, because we serve the community. It's not the other way around.
Chief Gross has focused a lot of his work with young people in Boston, including Operation Ceasefire, aimed at curbing youth violence. Now, women, especially women of color, made history in elections across the state last year. Framingham voters elected Dr. Yvonne Spicer, their first mayor ever, and an African-American STEM educator who knew a thing or two about being the first in her field.
All the duties incumbent upon me as mayor of the city of Framingham.
My race, my gender was transcended by the fact that they believed in me to lead this city.
It was a history-making election. Framingham residents were choosing a mayor for the first time since the city was founded in 1700. And it was a history maker who won the seat.
I always had a curiosity of how things work, and I ultimately went on to study architecture in high school and went on to study technology education, creating. And that was something, too, that was important to me. We have cameras on different strategically throughout the community.
I met Dr. Yvonne Spicer in her office, just a couple of weeks on the job, and one snowstorm under her belt. But her story actually began in Bed-Stuy, New York, as a little girl who loved to take things apart.
I was probably about 7 years old and took apart the blender, and I was fascinated what was causing those, blades to move around.
At 6 years old, Mayor Spicer had a life-defining moment, meeting Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm.
All discrimination is anti-human.
It set the tone for a lifetime of trailblazing.
This woman made social justice for women, or rights for women, fashionable way before they were. The fact that she was the first woman to ever run for president is pretty remarkable. Fast forward, here I am.
A black woman in STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math. She was almost a statistical anomaly. According to a 2011 census report, 6% of all U.S. STEM workers were African American, almost none of them women. Mayor Spicer credits her family and mentors for always encouraging her.
They've given me not only the tools to say move forward, but they've also given me the permission to say yes, you can.
Before she was the first mayor, she was the first African American female technology director for Framingham schools. She was the first black woman vice president at the Museum of Science, and she was one of the first appointed to the inaugural Massachusetts STEM Advisory Council.
For all of America.
Mayor Spicer tells me it's young women today marching and running for office who are her true inspiration.
That's the new face of leadership. That's the new way in which young women are not, they're not afraid to jump out and take a chance. And I'm excited about that.
I asked Mayor Spicer what her advice to future leaders would be. She said, be humble, be mentored, and volunteer. There's always something you can give. He's a civil rights activist who led Boston through its most turbulent conflicts. In just minutes, I sit down with legendary community organizer Mel King, almost 90 years old and still fighting for equality.
Where you have influence or power, never, ever, ever forget where you came from.
But first, the first black president of a local college describes his climb up the ivory tower from humble beginnings in Kansas. Next.
Without diversity, we cannot be excellent.
My interview with Dr. Lee Pelton brought me back to my alma mater, Emerson College. Dr. Pelton became the first black president of Emerson College in 2011, but he's no stranger to being the first person of color in the president's chair. He's done it his entire career, and now he's credited with changing a boutique communication school into a major player in the redesign of Boston's downtown.
I would say when you arrive at some point where you have influence or power, never, ever, ever forget where you came from. I tell my students that there's no substitute for authenticity. People gravitate towards people who are authentic.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how cool is Prezi Pete?
10.
10.
10 and a half, man.
I'd say 11. I'd go as far to say as 11.
Emerson College President Lee Pelton says authenticity is an important tool to have, especially at one of the most uniquely authentic schools in the country. Dr. Pelton's story is a unique one, too, and starts of all places in Wichita, Kansas.
I bring to it particularly my own growing up as a poor working class kid. I grew up in a house without indoor plumbing until I was 6 years old. I was first in my family to go to college.
Dr. Pelton was one of 4 kids. His mother was a homemaker, his father was a laborer, and later managed the Wichita Police Department. Dr. Pelton tells me he knew early on he wanted to be in academia, and he set his goal while getting his doctorate at Harvard, college president by 40.
I understood that as much as I loved the contemplative life, what I really gravitated towards was a life where I could make a big impact.
After deanships at Colgate University and Dartmouth College, Pelton became the first African-American college president at Willamette University in 1998. He became the first African-American president of Emerson College in 2011.
There are folks who I think who see me in that role and think that I'm in that role because of some affirmative action, which is, not the case. It's never been the case for me. That perception diminishes, your value.
Dr. Pelton tells me he's proud of the value he brought to Emerson. He's credited with helping to reshape Boston's downtown. The school has broken ground on an $85 million Los Angeles satellite center, and they've entered into a partnership with the Ambassador Theater Group at the Colonial Theater. But the lack of diversity remains a problem. Less than 3% of the student body is African American.
We increased diversity by 100%. In about a 4-year period. Here we're doing better, but not where I think we should be.
Dr. Pelton tells me creating access to higher ed to those students is personal to him.
For people of privilege and wealth, the networking is visible. It's right. It's in the air they breathe. It's they touch it. It's and they know what to do. And so what I want to do is to make that world, which is invisible to those of privilege, I want to make that world visible to students for whom it has mostly been invisible.
Dr. Pelton keeps a Vietnamese proverb close at hand. When eating fruit, remember who planted the tree. When drinking clear water, remember who dug the well.
Tears came to my eyes because I can only imagine what it means for little girls growing up in the city of Boston.
Making history, 6 women of color now sit on the Boston City Council. Our candid conversation about the future of the city. But first, his life of public service and activism spans 60 years. Legendary community leader Mel King gives his advice to younger generations fighting for equality today. Legendary community organizer Mel King led the way during Boston's most turbulent conflicts. The 89-year-old civil rights activist is credited with forming Boston into the city it is today, bringing groups separated by race, gender, and sexuality together in a time when it was not only unexpected, it was dangerous.
When you think of Boston's South End, what comes to mind? Historic brownstones, 5-star restaurants, a community of inclusion. Now imagine it gone. In the 1960s, city officials took a wrecking ball to 24 acres of what was called Boston Skid Row, displacing hundreds of families in the name of urban renewal. And a young Mel King wasn't having that. He was born here in the South End in 1928, one of 8 kids, and he and his neighbors would fight to save it.
We took a stand. This here area where we're right now, they were going to make into a parking lot, etc. We rimmed it and stopped them from parking, and then Tent City unfolded.
In 1968, hundreds of demonstrators camped in a parking lot where homes once stood, calling for affordable housing. 20 years later, the Tent City housing development was built.
We, in the community, made the city honor its federal commitment, and so doing, the decisions about what could get built and under what circumstances were right in the hands of the people who were affected.
I met legendary community organizer Mel King at the now iconic South End Technology Center, one of his many bases of operations for the last 60 years as a teacher, youth worker, fair housing advocate, 10-term state senator, and in 1983, the first African American to run in a final election bid for the mayor of Boston.
We had begun to build this network of different groups who had been pushed aside.
King also ran for Boston School Committee 3 times, a decade before forced busing forced integration into Boston.
The city was still alive with all the antagonistic and racist approaches that we got to be known for.
He spent his career advocating for inclusion and access, including access to technology. As an adjunct professor at MIT, he created the Community Fellows Program in 1996.
They talked about this being the information highway, but a lot of people can't get on it, and they get bypassed.
More than 20 years later, he's still creating access to that information superhighway with after-school programs here at the Technology Center, including computer programming, 3D printing, and music producing. He shared with me some of his original work inspired by Barack Obama's presidency.
I want you to know my story.
I asked King what advice he would give those kids and other activists coming behind him.
They have to define for them what kind of world they want to live in.
That one really swings.
Now King continues to influence the next generation, collaborating with Boston Public Schools and inspiring activists in the Occupy and Black Lives Matter movements. The Mel King Institute opened in 2009 to continue his legacy.
People feeling a greater promise and stakeholder in government because they see themselves reflected.
Breaking barriers on the Boston City Council, these 6 women reached an amazing milestone, but they're not stopping now. Their hopes for the future of Boston when we come back. It was a historic election. 6 women of color seated on the Boston City Council last November. The council elected its first black female president just a month ago. I sat down with these influencers for a frank conversation about sexism, racism, and their vision for the future of the city.
What do you think it says about the city of Boston that a year after President Trump was elected, that the city then elected 6 women of color to the Boston City Council?
Boston hasn't skipped a beat. We have always been a city that has welcomed everyone from all backgrounds, every nationality, every religious affiliation, age, income, etc. And I think our policies that the council of this last term and the council of this new term have put into place and are working on continue to reflect that commitment.
Mm-hmm. I'd add that we still have work to do. I think that this is an incredible thing to celebrate. It's something that we should spend some time talking about and reflecting on how and why, but also recognize that we've got so much more work to do as a city, as a state, and certainly as a nation.
What was it like being sworn in and then looking around you and seeing your fellow counselors around you?
It's an incredible feeling. Just sitting here with my 5 colleagues feels great. I do think being a woman changes the game in a lot of ways. We don't have to look at studies that tell us that women get things done. We don't waste time. We tend to work more collaboratively than some of our colleagues.
And Councilor Campbell, you're the first African-American woman city council president. I mean, what was that like for you?
Tears came to my eyes because I can only imagine what it means for little girls growing up in the city of Boston or in Massachusetts who are paying attention to the council and the work we do and see themselves now as someone who can serve in this capacity, serve as an elected at any level of government. That gavel was handed over to her by the first woman of color council president and the first Asian American female elected to the Boston City Council in Michelle Wu. Mm-hmm. And I think all of us are really the beneficiaries of incremental progress that's been happening relative to gender and racial parity in government and a more inclusive and representative government. I remember running for the Boston City Council for the first time in 2009. I was the only woman running in that field of 15 candidates. And we were walking in the Caribbean Carnival Parade, torrential downpour. You all know it rains every carnival. And I was leading the carnival parade, and little girls along the route were saying, "Who is Ayanna?" And I would raise my hand in this downpour and say, "I am." And I kid you not, multiple girls said, "That is my name too, can I walk with you?" And I turned to my team and I said, if we lose in the traditional sense, we've already won. And that's the power of representation. People feeling a greater promise and stakeholder in government because they see themselves reflected.
Did you have folks that doubted your ability to represent that part of the city?
I don't think that there was ever a doubt that in the capability, right? It was whether that I could win the race. And I think that that's, that's usually something that we struggle with in general when you're trying to run. If you're a candidate, if you're not well known, if you may not be born and raised in Boston, there might be certain indications or questions about whether you can really represent any Boston town or the whole town.
There's a lot of comparisons that people can make. I would often get, as I was canvassing and talking to residents, are you like Chuck or you like Tito? And so really having to put out, you know, I'm Kim, I'm like Kim, and the way that I will lead, the way that I will listen, the way that I will respond, the way that I will advocate will be what I bring as someone to the City Council, and not necessarily what someone else before me has done.
Councilor Asabi-George, you mentioned that there's work to be done. What do you see as some of the big issues that need to be tackled right now?
I'd say as a city, we need to make sure that we focus our energy on education. I know Kim and I have talked a lot about education. I'm a former teacher in the city, and we just have so much work ahead of us to do. But we also have an incredible housing crisis. We need to make sure that we're all talking about it, which we are, but that the work is also happening.
We've got a huge wealth gap that we know between Black Bostonians and white Bostonians. There's a lack of representation in terms of leadership in the Latino community. And so we have a lot more work to do. So it's great that the 6 of us sit here, but there's just a lot more to do.
Because we've reached this great milestone of 6 doesn't mean that we shouldn't be cultivating the future leaders in the city of Boston, statewide, nationwide, that work has to also continue.
Your districts all elected you all, but there are still sentiments of racism. There are people who are dealing with this every single day. What do you wish that your example would change?
You belong everywhere, right? And you need to go everywhere, and you need to connect with everyone. You need to be okay with extending your hand and waiting patiently for the other person to respond. And that can be painful.
What I would like is for us to actualize the aspiration of this city. In many ways, we are better than we used to be. We are evidence of that. We are the manifestation of that, but we're still not who we can be.
For an extended version of all of our conversations, go to boston25.com/Black History. Boston 25 News is proud to partner with the Mayor's Office for Boston's Black History Art Contest. It's open to Boston students in grades 6 through 12. You'll find contest details on the boston25.com more page. Thanks for joining us this Boston 25 News special presentation on Black History Month. Good night.